Good evening, doctors. Welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Spasticity, Diagnosis, Pathophysiology and Management. This initiative is coming to you through a digital initiative by Health and You. Always together, Health and You is a joint venture with New Link Company Limited, Japan. We have a vision of fulfilling unmet medical needs. We have very few products, but most of them are first time in India. We launch innovative products. For example, Amnurite, Amitriptyline plus Mecobalamin combination for the first time in India. And we have a unique strength, Amnurite 5 milligram, suggested by neurologist, Amnurite 10 and Amnurite 25 for painful neuropathy and for migraine. We have for the first time in India, a combination of amitriptyline and propranolol when one drug is not enough in migraine, Amnurite beta. Here also we have 520 strength and 1040 strength. We have Amnurite P where pregabalin is given in a sustained release form to match pharmacokinetic profile of amitriptyline for 24 hours pain relief. In moderate to severe neuropathic pain, Amnurite P. We have a mecobalamin injection imported from Japan to give you the highest quality in neuropathic pain. We have introduced a new strength of clobazam, 2.5 milligram. Again, a suggestion from neurologist. Add clobaz 2.5, 5 and 10. All the three are in mouth dissolving form to add flexibility, add control in your step ladder treatment of epilepsy. Today's topic is on spasticity, and we have a very specific product, Baclofen. Our brand name is Backrite. We have 45% less price in Backrite. So Baclofen with the right to save. And one more feature is the tablet size of Backrite is extremely small. You can see here Backrite tablet size as compared to the normal tablet available in the market. Backrite 20XR and Backrite 30XR. And recently we have launched a new concept of vitamin therapy in migraine, suggested by American Academy of Neurology and International Headache Society. Brentamine, riboflavin 200 milligram, magnesium 200 milligram, and CoQ10 to support conventional therapy also in pregnancy migraine and growing up children where you may not give conventional treatment because they interfere in cognition. All these webinars, including today's webinar, are available on our channel, DG Neuro on YouTube. Please like it, subscribe it. Now we have more than 40 webinars on this channel, DG Neuro. So this is becoming a resource for all of you. I have great pleasure in introducing today Dr. Madhushri Sengupta, who is a consultant in neurorehabilitation from Institute of Neurosciences, Kolkata. She is a recipient of President's Gold Medal at national level exit exam. She has done postdoctoral fellowship from a prestigious institute, NIMANS, Bangalore. Madam has several awards, for example, IAPMR, Dadechi Award, Bindeshwari Sudarshan Gold Medal Award. She has published her research papers in national and international journals. And apart from excelling in science, she also excels in art, performing arts. She has a degree in contemporary dance, so she excels both. So I have great pleasure in introducing and handing over session to Dr. Madhushri Sengupta. Madam, please take it over. Thank you.
Madam, we are mute, ma'am. Ma'am, you are mute.
Sir, your slide is seen. Now you can stop sharing so that Madam can start. Yes. Madam, please start.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible, madam. Please.
Okay. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this program. Today's evening, it's about spasticity, and we have some eminent neurologists, neurosurgeons, intensivists of the city with us today. So first, I would like to introduce our speakers as well as the panelists. So amongst our speakers, I don't think the slides are moving. Is the slide moving?
Madam, your first slide is on, Dr. Bhaskar Ghosh.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So amongst our speakers, we first have Dr. S.S. Anand, who is an eminent neurologist of the city. He's a consultant neurologist from Institute of Neurosciences, Kolkata. And his areas of interest are dementia, Parkinson's, epilepsy, headache, and neuroimmunology. Then we have Dr. Amit Kumar Ghosh. He's a consultant neurosurgeon from Institute of Neurosciences, Kolkata. So he, in his great repertoire of work, he's been in National Neurosciences Center, Calcutta Peerless Hospital, BK Roy Research Center. He's a fellow of microneurosurgery from Japan, a fellow in neuroendoscopy, subspecialty training in functional epilepsy surgery. He also has experience of working across the globe in Ohio State, USA for 3 months, with Nottingham University, UK, with Professor Shurajit Basu for 3 months, then epilepsy surgery at London, UK, again for 2 months. And his subspecialty of interest is functional neuromodulation, stereotaxis, and epilepsy. He is the proud recipient of Mother Teresa Shadbhavana Award, which he received in 2013 by the Global Achievers Foundation, and also the Indian Achievers Award for Chikitsak Ratan in 2013, which he received, was given by the Global Society for Health and Educational Growth. Then we have our eminent panelists, Dr. Bhaskar Ghosh. He's one of the most well-known names in neurology. He's a diploma cardiology, MD, DNB, MNA, MS, DM neurology, FICP, fellowship in movement disorders from Calgary, Canada. He's the additional chief health director of neurology in B.R. Singh Hospital and Center for Medical Education and Research, Kolkata. And his professional interests are movement disorder, vertigo, epilepsy, headache, and teaching. He has publications, more than 50 publications in national and international journals and books. And he's also the founder member of the Movement Disorder Society of India, convener of the Movement Disorder Forum of Kolkata, vice chairman of the West Bengal branch of Indian Rheumatology Association, ex-vice chairman of Association of Physicians of India West Bengal chapter, and a senior DNB teacher. Along with that, we also have Dr. Indranil Ghosh, senior consultant and neurointensivist of Institute of Neurosciences, Kolkata. And he's from the Department of Neuroanesthesia, Critical Care, Pain and Palliative Medicine at Institute of Neurosciences, Kolkata. So these are our speakers and panelists, and a very warm welcome from my side to be a part of this evening. Now, before we begin with the topic proper, I am going to give a very small overview of the management of spasticity in a nutshell. So, I start with your permission. So, if we look at management of spasticity at a glance, I don't think the slides are moving. Please give me a minute. So spasticity is a disorder of the sensory motor control resulting from an upper motor neuron lesion presenting as intermittent or sustained involuntary activation of muscles, and it is characterized by increased involuntary velocity dependent tonic stretch reflex, that is the muscle tone, with exaggerated tendon jerks resulting from hyperexcitability of the stretch reflex. This is an acceptable and popular definition of spasticity. So any physician can deal with spasticity, but professionals who deal with spasticity in their day-to-day lives are neurologist, neurosurgeon, physiatrist, orthopedic surgeon, interventional pain specialist, advanced practice clinician, and therapist, physiotherapist, occupational therapist, speech language pathologist. So spasticity is a multidisciplinary approach, and there are different ways of approaching it. So we can divide the management into pharmacological, surgical, and non-pharmacological. In pharmacological, the most accepted drugs are baclofen, benzodiazepines, dantrolene sodium, clonidine, tizanidine, tolperisol. There are lots of literature which has use of other drugs like gabapentin, cannabinoid, etc. But I believe this will be taken up in detail later on. There are the local interventions like diagnostic nerve blocks with local anesthesia, lidocaine or bupivacaine. This can also act as a precursor for further interventions. There is chemoneurolysis with phenol or ethyl alcohol. This is not much done these days because of the adverse effect profile, and chemodenervation with botulinum toxin, which is extremely useful as a therapy, as a therapeutic agent, as well as making the patient ready for a further program of spasticity management. Coming to the non-pharmacological management, which is a very important cornerstone of spasticity management, one has to begin with patient education, recognizing and preventing factors that may exacerbate the spasticity and spasms, optimize the bladder bowel management, and the skin integrity. So this again has a lot of subdivisions. So first, if I look at the physical therapy, the physiotherapy and occupational therapy, so it is all focused on prevention of contracture and maintaining the muscle length. So that can be done by positioning, joint range of motion, active and passive. So it can be done manually as well as with machines like CPM, muscle stretching, strengthening, standing. Standing has a lot of psychological benefit plus therapeutic benefit. So whether it's a standing frame or a wheelchair, motorized wheelchair, it is an important goal for every physician or therapist to achieve. Muscle re-education, advanced technologies like EMG and functional electrical stimulation based biofeedback, constraint induced movement therapy, where one is stopping the sound limb from acting, so thereby forcing the spastic limb to work, and functional training. Now, all the things that are done are based on the principle of tone normalization. Tone normalization again could be either because, can be done by proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, Bobath approach, Brainstorm approach, because spasticity has a sensory component to it as well. So the sensory motor approach or rude approach and motor relearning. It all depends on whether we want the primitive reflexes to persist or we want to suppress it and make the person learn new technologies. Again, there are the physical modalities that is used like electrical stimulation, NMES, electroacupuncture, vibration therapy, which is focal or whole body, extracorporeal shockwave therapy, thermotherapy, cryotherapy, hydrotherapy. Along with that, there is use of orthosis and casts. So either there is serial casting done with or without botulinum toxin, or orthosis like ankle foot orthosis given, which could be again of different types depending on which muscle is strong, which muscle is more spastic, what the patient needs. Knee brace, knee ankle foot orthosis, wrist hand orthosis, resting, cock up or dynamic, antepronator orthosis, and elbow gaiter. Apart from this, there are other methods which have been used for spasticity management. Most of them, if we look at systemic reviews and meta-analysis, they show low to moderate to low evidence. However, there is a body of research growing up surrounding these. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation, robotics, hippotherapy, body weight supported treadmill training, music therapy is coming up, and movement therapy. So finally, we have the surgical management, which I believe Dr. Amit Ghosh will be taking up, and I'm just giving the highlights. Important is intrathecal drug administration with an intrathecal baclofen pump for a very generalized resistant spasticity, rhizotomy, then central electrical stimulation, peripheral neurectomy, and neuroablative procedures like cordotomy and myelotomy. Also, there are the surgeries, orthopedic and rehabilitative surgeries like tendon lengthening procedures, tendon release, Z-plasty, tenotomy, myotomy, tendon transfer procedures, which are done with the view that either orthotic fitment will be better or the ambulation will be better. So this is in a very short nutshell, the management of spasticity. We will, after this, we will take up spasticity in detail as we proceed. So, should we move on to the lecture, sir?
Yes.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Okay. So, with this, I will once again welcome and introduce our first speaker for the evening, Dr. S.S. Anand. Sir, you may start your presentation, sir, if you want.
Yes, sir. Slides are visible. You can put it on presentation mode.
Slides are visible. Acha, just one minute.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Probably I'm audible to all of you.
Yes, you are.
And what I will be presenting is the pathophysiology, diagnosis, and medical management of spasticity. And spasticity is a very common problem for all the neurologists and the neurosurgeons because of a lot of patients coming with stroke and lot of degenerative and at least demyelinating conditions which are producing spasticity in many patients. Coming to the spasticity, basically, spasticity in a nutshell is defined as disordered sensory motor control resulting from an upper motor neuron lesion presenting as intermittent or sustained involuntary activation of muscles. So this is very important that this is a sensory motor phenomena rather than a motor phenomena only. Most of the time what we are seeing is basically a motor thing in which the patient is having an abnormally placed posture of the limbs. But actually it's a sensory motor phenomenon, so this thing we should remember very significantly. The exact prevalence of spasticity is not known till now. At least 1/3 of the stroke survivors will be having this spasticity, and almost 50% of them will be developing the contractions. This is one of the most worrisome things that we see in the management of the spasticity. To start with, I will start with the pathophysiology and just a word on the physiology of the muscle movement. If we see tone is the resistance of the resting muscle to the passive movements. And the tone is actually the viscoelastic properties of muscle and the neural drive from the spinal motor neurons. So the tone consists of two important things. One is the viscoelastic property and the second is the neural drive. These two things are very important for the maintenance of the normal tone. And if we see viscosity is the resistance of the tissue to deforming forces, whereas elasticity is the ability of the tissue to return to its original position. So both the deformation and coming back to the original position is viscoelastic property of the muscle, which maintains the tone of the muscle. And if we see the normal physiology of the muscle, this slide is not that much good, but what we see here, just to remember a few things what we learned in our MBBS first year is, these are the intrafusal fibers and these are extrafusal fibers. And we can see that nuclear back fibers are there and these are nuclear chain fibers. So just we can see that what happens when the corticospinal tract movement starts. The movement starts from the corticospinal tract. It comes to the gamma motor neuron here. We can see that this is the gamma motor. It comes to the gamma motor neuron. It goes to the intrafusal fibers. The intrafusal fibers start contracting. As the intrafusal fibers start contracting, there will be activation of the nuclear bag and the chain fibers. And this sensation will go back through a gamma, through a one-A afferent fibers to the alpha motor neuron. And finally, this alpha motor neuron will send a signal for the contraction of the extrafusal fibers. So this is the general chain that we are seeing, that how a normal tone is maintained in the muscle. It is the viscoelastic property of the extrafusal fibers and these intrafusal fibers which are activated by the corticospinal tract, and the reflex contraction of the extrafusal fibers maintains the actual tone of the muscle. as we know, very commonly we know about the stress reflex. I will just mention about the stress reflex. Whenever a hammer is hit over the knee, the muscle spindles in the extraphyseal fibers, they get activated, and what they do basically is they send signals through the dorsal root to the alpha motor neuron, and there is contraction of the to the agonist group of muscle, and in the same way there is the antagonist muscle gets inhibited. So there is hyperreflexia, or there is increased reflexes that we see in the knee jump. And if the same time suddenly if a muscle is stretched, there are other fibers also like the Golgi tendon organs, which will suddenly cause the loss of the inhibition because they activate the interneurons, and that will cause the inhibition of the agonist muscle. So these things should be remembered because these receptors are very important. These Golgi tendon organs, whenever they will be activated, they will cause hypotonia. Suddenly they will stop the movement of the muscle. And they are very important in the pathophysiology of the this is spasticity. If we see the upper motor neuron, what we said about the control of the tone, the cortex, what we remember, the whole of the motor movement is planned in this premotor and the supplementary motor area. Then it goes to the cortex, the motor cortex, and from there it is activated. So the corticospinal tract goes down. This is the lateral corticospinal tract, which we see here, which is the most important tract to control the motor movements. But the tone is definitely controlled by two different other tracts, like the lateral vestibular, the tract from lateral vestibular nuclei, which is the vestibulospinal tract, and ventral vestibulospinal tract. And there is from the reticular formation, there are two tracts that are coming down, which will control the tone of the muscle. One is the ventral reticulospinal tract, and one is the dorsal reticulospinal tract. So these two tracts are in fact, three tracts maintain the tone of the muscles, and the cortical movement is basically the motor movement is maintained by the cerebral cortex. If any damage happens to these, either to the brainstem or to these connections of the brainstem to the spinal cord, there is increased reflexes. So what we see, there is decreased strength because of the loss of the corticospinal fibers. The reflexes are increased because of, thus I have shown you that there is loss of there is increased stress reflex because the cortical inhibition is lost. Cortical inhibition from the vestibulospinal tract and reticulospinal tract is lost, and that's why the tone is also increased. If we see, the increased tone initially is result from the excessive neural drive of the spinal motor neurons, and later is partly because of the viscoelastic change. In the initial part is the excessive drive, but the later part is because of the viscoelastic changes, but that occurs in the immobilized muscles and joints. Motor neurons respond to a stretch at a lower threshold. So the threshold for the motor neurons to respond to a stretch reflex has came down to very low, and there is a plateau potential also. So the spasticity develops at that point of time. This results in change from a balance between inhibitory and excitatory inputs to the spinal motor neurons in favor of excitation. So the whole thing is excited. If we see what causes spasticity is basically I have shown here there are these two parts, the vestibulospinal tract and the reticulospinal tract. If the damage occurs to these tracts, the loss of inhibition over the spinal motor neurons occurs. And the second is the important thing, the intraspinal part. If we see the intraspinal part, I will come to the intraspinal part later. First, I will just discuss the supraspinal pathway. If the release of brainstem reflexes from cortical inhibition, this is very important. Brainstem reflexes, that is from the vestibulospinal tract and the reticulospinal tract. If these reflexes are lost, then there will be increased spasticity, or there is overactivity of noradrenergic pathways from locus coeruleus, or there is overactivity of serotonergic pathway from raphe nucleus. So supraspinal pathways, these are the three important mechanisms by which the spasticity can be produced. But if we see the spinal level, in the spinal level itself, there are a lot of changes are occurring, which causes the increased tone in the patients. This occurs because of the loss of recurrent inhibition mediated by the motor axon collaterals. We can see that this is the alpha motor neuron. These are the Renshaw cells, and if these Renshaw cells they are basically inhibitory. If the alpha motor neurons are excessively active, they can inhibit the alpha motor neurons. So loss of this inhibition is also one of the cause of this spasticity. The second one is the loss of this reciprocal inhibition from the antagonist muscle. The antagonist muscle itself inhibits the alpha motor neuron of the agonist muscle. So loss of this antagonist muscle will also produce the same thing. The presynaptic inhibitory inhibition, if there is loss of presynaptic inhibition, and if there is reduced inverse stage reflex mediated by the Golgi tendon organs. If the Golgi tendon organs, the inhibitory mechanism, as I told you also earlier also, if there is sudden stage, the Golgi tendon organs can definitely produce the antagonism of those sudden stage. So at the spinal level itself, there are a lot of changes that are occurring, which will cause the increased spasticity. So as I told you, spinal motor, sometimes there is increased denervation, supersensitivity to the spinal motor neurons also. And this is the coming to the, this is because of the anterior horn cells. And sometimes there can be collateral sprouting also. That will also cause the same thing. And the spasticity is also produced from the muscles and joints. That there is shortening of the sarcomeres. There is loss of elastic tissue, and the fibrofatty deposits in muscle and tendons are also there. So this is the basic pathophysiology through which the spasticity develops. And as I have shown that it is not only from the supraspinal part, it is the spinal part also, and then gradually coming to the muscle itself, which is causing the whole mechanism of spasticity. Sometimes when we are seeing spasticity, we will be seeing different mechanisms. Few of them are like clonus. This is the phenomena of involuntary rhythmic contraction in response to sudden stage. If we produce sudden stage, there will be rhythmic contraction. This is because of the activation of the Golgi tendon organs. Spasm, sudden involuntary movements, and often involve multiple. This flexor is fast, and these things we are seeing regularly. So sudden involuntary spasm can also occur. These are basically part of the withdrawal reflexes that we see. And spastic dystonia, tonic muscle overactivity that occurs without any triggers. It is due to an inability of the motor units to cease firing after a voluntary reflex contraction, resulting in sustained muscle contractions. And spastic co-contractions, inappropriate activation of antagonist muscles during voluntary activity. It is due to loss of reciprocal inhibition during voluntary muscle. So these are the phenomena that we can see with the spasticity. Clonus, spastic dystonia, and the spastic co-contractions in which there are the agonist and antagonist muscles are contracting together. So once we are evaluating the patients of spasticity, what are the specific points that we should look after? One is the differentiation of spasticity from other causes of increased tone, like rigidity and contractures, identification of potential triggers, measurement of spasticity, and assessment of impact on function. These are the very important things that we should evaluate while examining spasticity. Few characteristics can help us to differentiate between the spasticity and the other phenomena like the rigidity and contracture. The first and foremost important thing that is spasticity is velocity dependence. As we will increase the velocity, the tone will increase. Suddenly the spasticity will increase. So it is a velocity dependent phenomena which will not occur in any other phenomena like contraction or Gegenhalt. Clasp knife phenomena. In clasp knife phenomena, if suddenly it's like a knife suddenly goes off, it is because of the activation of the Golgi tendon organ. And this is a very characteristic phenomena of spasticity also that we will see. Stroking effect, if we stroke the muscle, the spasticity will go down, and this is not going to occur with the contractures, and this sometimes helps us to differentiate between the spasticity and the contractures. And the distribution of the muscles, as we know that spasticity is affecting most of the anti-gravity muscles. So the distribution of the muscle is very much helpful to differentiate from the other form of the spasticity, other causes of increased tone. If we see the spasticity of the upper extremities, and which is usually seen after cerebral palsy, stroke, or traumatic brain injury, there is adduction and internal rotation of the shoulder, which is characteristically seen. Flexion of the elbow and the wrist. There is pronation of the forearm. There is flexion of the fingers and adduction of the thumb. So this is a very characteristic posture that we'll be seeing in most of these patients. And if we see the spasticity in the lower extremities, there will be sometimes what will be seen in the equinovarus deformity that we'll be seeing with the spasticity. And what we characteristically see is hip adduction and flexion, knee flexion, and ankle plantar flexion or equinovarus positioning. These are very important. Sometimes this helps us in differentiating from other causes of increased tone like dystonia. These are some of the factors which we should remember, that what can cause the or aggravate this spasticity, like pressure ulcers, ingrown toenails, skin infection, injuries, constipation, UTI, urinary tract calculi, deep brain thrombosis, improper posturing, ill-fitting orthotics, and sometimes post-traumatic syringomelia. These are the features which can cause sometimes increase in the spasticity of the patients. And we can measure spasticity. There are some electrophysiological measures like H reflex and F reflexes. Sometimes we can use some scales like modified Ashworth scale. Probably this is the most common scale that is being used. Trade scale and pendulum test are also there. Response frequency can also be measured. And along with this, there are patient-reported scales also, like visual analog scales. And this is one of the form that I have just shown, the modified Ashworth scale, which shows from no increase in muscle tone to marked increase in 0 to 4, that is marked increase in muscle tone. Affected part is rigid. So between these, we can just scale them before starting the treatment. So we can measure the treatment. Coming to the management, the goals of treatment should be very clear from the initial point of view only. And what we have to see is, sometimes we can get the goal also, what we have achieved, what outcome we have expected is much worse than expected, somewhat worse than expected, or achieve the expected outcome, somewhat better than expected, or much better than expected outcome. We can differentiate between this and just we can plan our management strategy according to the what we can achieve. When we start management, the positioning of the patient is very important. This is just a simple diagram, just a simple picture to show how to position the patient in a bed. Probably Dr. Madhusri will be more able to describe this thing, but what we have shown, this picture very clearly shows that how a patient of spasticity should be positioned in a lying position. And the same thing, this is very important, how they should be positioned in the wheelchair. And these things are very important to manage spasticity, because injuries are very common to this patient while transferring from one place to another, or while in a sitting position or in a lying position. When we consider non-pharmacological interventions, coming to the passive movements, passive stretching that most of the time are done by the physiotherapist. And passive stretching decreases the excitability of motor neurons and maintains the viscoelastic properties of muscles and joints. And this is very important to start with. Isokinetic dynamometers are also available. These devices can standardize the passive stretches, means they can just fix the total number of stretches that are being given and how much of the stretches are given. This can be standardized. And prolonged stretching has been shown to reduce contractures. This is one of the phenomena that is important. The effect of stretching on spasticity and contractures is still largely evidence-free. However, there is no evidence that it is harmful. So, though the papers, Dr. Madhusri will be better to tell me what paper I have found has written very clearly that there is no significant evidence, though there is no significant evidence, but there are no significant harms also with this stretching. Exercises. Exercise usually improve motor control and cardiovascular fitness in people with upper motor neuron disorders, whereas exercises improve strength or overall function in people with spasticity. There is only very limited evidence that they directly reduce spasticity. Biofeedback, as Dr. Madhusri has told, it uses visual or auditory cues to help patients judge their performance. And this, as I told you, sometimes since it is a sensory motor phenomenon, this can be very much helpful in some patients. Biofeed can be sometimes very much helpful. Standing for about, it has been seen that standing for about half an hour a day may help to reduce spasticity, and this is very important. And so we are using this table to make the patient stand in most of these patients. And coming to the physical modalities, and these physical modalities are based on three principles. One is the modulating the viscoelastic properties of muscles and tendons. What we are using to modulate this is cryotherapy, ultrasound therapy, and shock wave therapy. The second one is inducing long-term depression at the spinal level and stimulating the cortical innervative pathways. As I told you, that spasticity is basically a phenomena which involves the three levels. One is the muscle level. For this, we can use the first method. The second one is the spinal level, which we can use magnetic stimulation. And the third one is inducing short-term plasticity in injured spinal motor systems or activation of proprioceptive inputs like TENS. And like Dr. Madhusri has told us that TMS is being tried out, TDCS is being tried out, and this can help us in spinal level of control of the supraspinal level of control of the spasticity. Coming to the oral medications, and we know about baclofen. Probably most of us are using this baclofen. Baclofen is a GABA B agonist, and it is a primary site of action is the spinal cord, where it reduces the release of excitatory neurotransmitter and substance P by binding to the GABA B receptor. The oral dose of baclofen used to treat spasticity range from 30 to 100 milligram per day. That's this we know. And sometimes the important thing is that tolerance may develop, and the drug must be tapered slowly to prevent withdrawal effects. So these two things are important. Sometimes the patient may develop tolerance to the drug we are using, and the drug must be tapered slowly, because if we suddenly taper the baclofen, the chances of having seizures are very high in this group of patients. Benzodiazepines we are using, but because of their sedative effects, they are avoiding the daytime, but they can be helpful in the night time. They can, especially when sleep is hindered because of this increased spasticity. Gabapentin and pregabalin, they have few trials have shown gabapentin effect of the gabapentin and pregabalin. Tizanidine is an alpha-2 receptor agonist, which enhances noradrenergic activity in the spinal cord and the brain. This is one of the molecules that acts on the spinal level and the supraspinal level, both in the spasticity. It's a very good drug, but the tolerability is also one of the factors. It inhibits spinal interneurons and tracks from locus ceruleus. So this is it's a good drug, but tolerability should be seen. Dantrolene, sometimes we use dantrolene. It blocks calcium release from sarcoplasmic reticulum and interferes with the excitation contraction coupling of the skeletal muscle. As I told you, because the spasticity the increased tone is because of the changes in the muscle also. So sometimes the use of dantrolene can be helpful to reduce the tone in this group of muscle. Cannabinoids, there are cannabinoid receptors in dorsal spinal cord, basal ganglia, hippocampus and cerebellum, and these modulate spasticity. If we see these cannabinoid receptors are present all over the spinal cord from the central nervous system. So one molecule is tetrahydrocannabinol, an agonist of cannabinoid 1 and 2 receptor, reduces spasticity but causes sedation and psychotropic. Our experience with these cannabinoids is very less, since we have not been using this drug. But as per the literature, they are useful. And finally, coming to the Botox injection, and this is chemodenervation, and sir is always there. Sir, Dr. Bhaskar is here, and he expertises in this thing. So basically, what happens once the botulinum toxin A goes into the pre-synaptic terminal, it just blocks the SNAP protein, SNAP 25, and stops the release of the acetylcholine. So once the acetylcholine is not released, the muscle contraction is stopped. So this is one of the basic mechanisms of Botox, how it works. And definitely it has, in recent years, the Botox has been in use in many spastic patients, and its use in spastic cerebral palsy patients has definitely been very much helpful, especially in their growth. It has been very much helpful. And hopefully Dr. Bhaskar will give us a highlight on how this can be very much helpful in treating spastic patients. Thank you from my perspective, and the surgical part will be taken care of by Dr. Amit Ghosh. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. It was a very detailed and nice presentation. I would request our discussion panelists, if they have any question regarding this presentation, we can take it up now. Dr. Bhaskar Boshu and Dr. Indranil Ghosh.
Thanks, Dr. Anand, for a very nice and very illuminating talk on spasticity. I think you have covered all the aspects of your topic. There is nothing new to say. And rather, I think in the management of spasticity, Dr. Madhusri Sengusto is a central person. So today also, she is also the central person in conducting this seminar, because she has to take the full charge of the patient. You know, in the management of spasticity, you cannot go alone. So you have to, someone has to take the charge of the patient. She will or he will find out the pros and cons, what treatment actually patient needs. Like, you know, in general, if a patient has generalized spasticity, we should go for oral drugs. If we have focal spasticity, we may go for chemodenervation like botulinum toxin therapy. But if you whatever you do, you need good physical rehab therapy. Otherwise, you cannot get the patient well. Actually, there is a lot of good and bad things about botulinum toxin, because it is very, you all know that it is very expensive therapy, and often the patient thinks that if I go for botulinum toxin therapy, I will be cured of spasticity. But this is not at all like that. You have to make the patient understand, because they are expending a lot of money. And I will later on discuss about botulinum toxin, but I think it is not the right time. But I want to impress on that it will help in physiotherapy and improving some of the patient's functions. Like if a patient in clenched fist cannot clean his hands properly, if you open the fist, so it will be of great help to the patient like that. So we'll come to that later on. If we have any questions, I think we can take, if there is any question in the chat box.
There is a question. Should we take it now, sir, or should we take it at the end?
So I have a
Dr.
question
Amit Ghosh?
to Dr. Anand and Dr. Bhaskar Ghosh, that when you will refer patient for surgery, if in a medically refractory spasticity, will you give Botox or will you consider doing surgery? So what is the point when you will say it is medically refractory or patient will need surgery?
Dr. Anand?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yeah. I can hear.
Because most of the patients we get from either pediatric neurologist of cerebral palsy or a neurologist, that it cannot be managed by other measures like oral, medications or any other things. So what is the cutoff point that you will say now you should go to surgeon, neurosurgeon or anything?
Definitely, sir. There are two things. As I told you, once we start the management of the patient of spasticity, we start, the goal should be initially planned that this is the goal probably what we should be planning of. And if we use, we start with using medicines, and definitely non-pharmacological management is very important, like the management from the rehab team, and with all the medicines that we can try of, because use of proper medicine is very important. Sometimes initially we may not get some response with the use of baclofen, initial oral baclofen and other. But gradually the patient starts improving with the gradual rehabilitation procedures. So initially what we see initially, if they respond very well with and we are able to achieve our goal, what we are planning for, then probably we are not sending the patients to the neurosurgeons. If despite being use of this thing, the spasticity keeps on increasing, like in some patients of like multiple sclerosis, or like some patients, or in some patients of non-compressive myelopathy. We know that even with the best management plan, the spasticity will keep on increasing. Then probably we are sending most of these patients to the neurosurgeons for further management. And most of the other patients like compressive myelopathy, these are seen by the neurosurgeons, and we know that even with the best management, if we are not able to control them, then we are sending these patients to the neurosurgeons for treatment. The use of baclofen, as sir has more experience with that, Botox, and usually we are using Botox, but there are, as sir has told very clearly, the cost of therapy is very high, And the second thing is that probably you'll have to repeat the injections either in the 3-4 months, and this repetition and everything is very cost effective for the patients and the family members. And at that point of time, probably the baclofen pump and this surgical methods can be helpful.
Yeah, because if we discuss the cost only, the pump, baclofen pump cost is probably much more than what Botox costs. And
Yeah,
that is the thing. And other kind of surgery what we have, selective dorsal rhizotomy also needs a very good electrophysiological infrastructure in that hospital, which most of the hospital probably doesn't have. So
yeah, most of the time when it is refractory, we are using that. Most of the time when it is.
And nowadays, probably because of programmability and reversibility, many centers, most of the centers are shifted to pump only rather than the SDR procedure. So what you will choose, either Botox or baclofen pump, or you will try giving Botox 2-3 times, and even after Botox it is not responding, then only you will transfer to.
Yeah, that is one of the points. And the second other important thing is that suppose if the patient is having hemiparesis and the other side looks to be quite okay. So probably in those cases, definitely the one side can go for surgical procedures, but it is more important to use the physical measures and the medicines compared to the use of any surgical method in those patients, because the other side is completely all right. And using the other pumps and other things will, I think, is not beneficial in these patients in which the patient is having very characteristic, one side is normal and one side is there. So most of the time, when we are referring the patients, they are having spasticity in both the lower limbs, or they are having paraparesis or quadriparesis. These are the most important, and we are sending only then if they are refractory. Then only we are sending. If they are not refractory to the medical and the non-conventional management, then we are not sending.
Can I say something here?
Yes,
Yes,
madam.
ma'am.
About Botox? If it is a small part involved, then you can go for Botox. But if it is a bigger part involved, bigger limb involved, how much Botox you are going to give? So many muscles in that case, I think so many times you have to give Botox and the complications, Botox toxicity and all these things. And so rehab, with what Dr. Bhaskar Ghosh said, that rehab and some part to facilitate rehabilitation, you can go for Botox. But otherwise, these cases, I think they should be referred to surgical management, like baclofen pump and all these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sir, if I may add, when there is a generalized spasticity, it is so much that the rehab measures can also not be applied properly, and orthosis cannot be fit properly. Wheelchair, the person cannot sit in the wheelchair properly. Caregiver guidance becomes very difficult. There is repeated pressure ulcers. Perineal hygiene is getting difficult, and it's very generalized. We cannot isolate the muscles and give botulinum toxin. In those cases, it's better to go for surgery. If not anything, at least orthotic fitment and caregivers. Caregivers can take care of the patient better. And of course, if they can afford, then definitely intrathecal pump. Till before that stage, I think it can be managed with medicine, botulinum toxin, and non-pharmacological management.
Yes. Thank you.
So there is one question in the chat group. Can we take that now? There are two questions.
Yes, yes.
Right. One is from Dr. Pallab Pradhan in Kolkata. He says, what is the difference between spasticity and rigidity? This question is for everyone. So that's the first.
I have in my talk only I have told the difference between the two things, how to differentiate between spasticity and other causes of the NP stone. First thing is spasticity is velocity dependent, which rigidity is not there. The second thing is that there is a clasp knife phenomena. Suddenly the tone will go off with the spasticity when you are checking. it will not occur with the rigidity. The third is the group of muscles that are involved. The group of muscles that are involved, it is the anti-gravity muscles that are usually involved in the spasticity, but the rigidity can involve all the group of the muscles that are present. So these are the three important points that we can use the difference between the spasticity and rigidity.
There's also one more question from Dr. Rinchen Keronga Dukpa from Darjeeling. He says, my wife has Parkinson's disease since last 6 years on left side. Now she has tightness of chest during off mode, even pain on right arm. So I
think Dr.
I'm not
Bhaskar, sir
Dr.
will answer.
Bhaskar
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question. I think this is if you say that your patient has got only Parkinsonian feature on one side, I think it is difficult to explain because in Parkinson's disease, it involves both the sides, but one side is more affected than other. But if the other side is not at all affected, then we should think of something else. That is our classical teaching, because the Parkinson's disease should involve both the sides, and particularly when you were saying that it is present for 5-6 years. Now, if I assume that the patient is really suffering from Parkinson's disease and she is suffering for more than 5-6 years, these sort of symptoms are not uncommon. These are actually non-motor features of Parkinson's disease, like feeling of tightness, which is mostly occurs during off period. So these are non-motor features of Parkinson's disease. Levodopa mostly takes care of these motor features, but non-motor features you have to assess, and we have to try with mix up with motor features, whether the motor features are totally controlled or not. Based on that, we may have to increase the therapy for Parkinson's disease. This much I can say without seeing the patient actually.
Thank you, sir. There is no further question in the group chat. So if the panelists, if you don't have any other question, should we proceed towards the next talk, sir? Right. Our next speaker is Dr. Amit Kumar Ghosh. Sir, you can start your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Madhusri. So, is it visible?
Yes, yes, sir, it's visible.
And am I audible?
Yes, sir, please carry on, sir.
Yes, so first I like to thank Health and You for creating these opportunities of learning session, and thanks all panelists to be here. So now we'll discuss the neurosurgical aspects of spasticity. After this excellent informative presentation by Dr. Madhusri and Dr. Anand, I will just focus on the surgical perspective. So spasticity, as Dr. Anand discussed, that the velocity-dependent increased resistance to passive stretch, exaggerated tendon jerks, and hyperexcitability of the stretch reflex. Now, neurosurgical treatment, what we have in our basket, that is selective dorsal rhizotomy, which is called SDR, rhizotomy, neurectomy, myelotomy, and cordectomy. So these four procedures are not very commonly done nowadays, but selective dorsal rhizotomy is an excellent procedure, but this requires a very special electrophysiological infrastructure, which most of the hospital probably doesn't have. That is the limitation of this procedure. But it is otherwise an excellent procedure and very cost effective. Now, other surgical intervention, what we have, sometimes it is required, is tendon lengthening, tendon transfer, and sometimes osteotomy, arthrodesis, tenotomy, myotomy. So all these are required in case of very neglected spasticity where contracture is already happened, which no other treatment will help. Then only this kind of treatments may be required by orthopedic and plastic surgeons. So this is the spectrum of management of spasticity, where we can see that there is a multidisciplinary approach by neurologist, rehabilitation specialist, and neurosurgeon, orthopedic surgeon, plastic surgeon. It may be rehabilitation and first oral drugs. We try with rehabilitation. If it fails, then we come to neurosurgery and baclofen pump therapy. So this is the traditional step ladder, which is already discussed. Now we'll focus on intrathecal baclofen therapy, which nowadays we have shifted our treatment to intrathecal baclofen therapy. Our selection criteria is severe spasticity, which is either 3 or more than 3 according to the modified Ashworth scale, or when the spasticity is refractory to oral medications or drugs are creating intolerable side effects and causing pain also, is very disabling day-to-day life, then only we consider intrathecal baclofen pump. And this is the modified Ashworth rating scale, which is already discussed by Dr. Anand. So potential benefits of intrathecal baclofen therapy, it of course reduces the spasticity, spasms and pain. It facilitates rehabilitation, functional improvements, and gives more independence to the patient. There will be ease of care. And most important thing, it's programmable and reversible. Therapy can be programmable. The ITB therapy, intrathecal baclofen pump, has 2 parts. One is first screening test and then proper placement of the pump. In the screening test, there will be initial test dose of baclofen after lumbar puncture. So what we do the bolus injection of baclofen intrathecally. A test dose of baclofen, which is given to the mid-lumbar or lumbar puncture, mid-lumbar space or lower lumbar region. And then we see the response, how spasticity is improving. A monitored environment is required for the screening test. A fully equipped setting to monitor the respiratory and cardiovascular systems of the patient, an apnea monitor and pulse oximeter. A fully staffed setting to monitor the patient's vital signs and resuscitative equipments. Intravenous IV drug like physostigmine should be considered to treat the symptoms of baclofen overdose. Now this is the ITB screening test. When at the day 1, we give the 50 microgram of the bolus dose of the injection after doing a lumbar puncture. If there is response, he is the candidate for baclofen pump. If there is no response or no improvement after giving 50 microgram of intrathecal test dose of baclofen, then the test has been repeated in the day 2, 24 hours after the first screening bolus. Then the dose will be 75 microgram. And if there is response, he is a candidate for implant. If there is no response, then the screening has to be repeated in the day 3. That is another 24 hours later of the second screening test. The test dose will be 100 microgram. Response, implant, no response, the stop screening. He is not a candidate for intrathecal baclofen pump therapy. Now, clinical response to medication. When we do the screening test, what is the response? What do you mean by response? When we give the test dose, the decrease of the muscle tone, at least 1 point of the modified Ashworth scale, in case of the spasticity of the cerebral origin, there has to be 1 point improvement after giving the test dose. And for the spasticity of spinal origin, there has to be a 2-point improvement of the spasticity and the spasms. Baclofen intrathecal begins to act 30 to 60 minutes after the injection, and the peak effect occurs approximately 4 hours after the bolus test dose. Effects may continue 4 to 8 hours. Now, if they pass the screening test, then we fix the date for pump implantation, the baclofen pump. So as a procedure, with the 2V needle, we do the lumbar puncture at the mid lumbar or upper lumbar level in an oblique and paramedian trajectory, and we negotiate our intrathecal catheter to the subarachnoid space of the interdural subarachnoid space. And the tip of the catheter, where we have to keep the tip of the catheter, it depends on what kind of spasticity and the involvement, the lower limb, upper limb, and the extent of involvement. Depending on the extent of involvement, the tip of the intrathecal catheter location will depend. As for example, the tip of the catheter will be T1 to T2 level for the spastic quadriplegia. And in case of diplegia, it will remain T6 to T10 level. And sometimes it is done for generalized secondary dystonia, where the catheter tip will be at the mid-cervical level. Now, after the subcutaneous tunneling, we connect the intrathecal catheter to the baclofen pump. After the pump, we program the pump for dose, daily dose and infusion rate. So that's the little glimpse of video. Yeah, where we can see the patient is in decubitus, lateral decubitus position, and this is the tube needle what we put, and this is the tunneler, subcutaneous tunneler, where from the lumbar region and through the subcutaneous space, this is the right iliac fossa, where this is one end of the tunneler, this is another end of the tunneler. So we'll put the pump at the right iliac fossa, and after subcutaneous tunneling, the tube will come from here to here, and it will be connected to the intrathecal catheter. That's the procedure, and we'll see another side. This is the pump. This is the pump itself that we'll put usually in the right iliac fossa. This is again the procedure, and here this is the where we connect the pump itself and the intrathecal catheter that we are connecting and tying it off. So that's the placement of the intrathecal pump at the right iliac fossa, at the subcutaneous subfacial plane. Subfacial plane in the anterior abdominal wall, right iliac fossa, and also left iliac fossa can be used depending on the familiarity of the surgeon. We usually put in the right iliac fossa, and then we stitch it. The placement of the pump. So, and during the placement of the catheter, intrathecal catheter, we do fluoroscopy to see the tip of the catheter level. See, this is the intradural catheter which is coming. This is the intradural catheter which is coming up to here. That is the upper border of the T10 vertebra. Because this patient was this is the example. This is one of our patients. Am I audible here?
Yes, sir, you're audible, sir.
Yes, so this is the patient of spinal trauma. He was operated elsewhere, and this spinal implant, we can see here, this is the screw and this is the rods, spinal cord injury. So fixation done elsewhere. After that, he has, after rehabilitation and oral medicine, he had not responded, and then he was referred to us for pump insertion. So this is the intrathecal catheter, and this is the tip. So we decide and we see the location, and that is the perfect position. So this is the picture where we can see that here is the pump, and through the lumbar or mid lumbar or upper lumbar region, we place the catheter intrathecally, and it goes up, depending on the spasticity. And this is the picture, and anterior abdominal wall looks like this, under the skin, under the subfacial plane. Programming, we do like that. There will be an antenna. This is the antenna, and this is the programmer. And by this programmer, we fix the daily dose, select the mode and infusion rate. And this is the pump, and this is the programmer, and this is the way we do it. This is the pump, and this is the spine. And this is the bigger picture of the Synchromate 2, that is the pump, where we can see this is the suture loop where we fix, pump is fixed by this loop. And this is the reservoir fill port. Patient comes for refilling every 1 month or 2 months or 3 months, depending on the dose he needs. So this is the refill port. And this is the catheter access port. In case of malfunction of the pump, sometimes we push the contrast material here, or some nuclear material, radioisotope from here to see the catheter function. And this is the catheter port where we fix the intradural catheter or intrathecal catheter, and the tubing we fix here. So maintenance therapy, spasticity, in case of spasticity of the spinal cord origin patients, the dose, maintenance dose, range from 12 microgram per day to microgram per day. It's a wide range. And most patients adequately maintained on 300 micrograms to 800 micrograms per day. There is a limited experience with daily dose greater than 1000 microgram per day. Now, in case of spasticity of cerebral origin patients, maintenance dose can be 22 to 1400 microgram per day, with most patients adequately maintained on 90 to 703 micrograms per day. In case of pediatric patients, it is under the 12 years. It ranges from 24 to 1199 microgram per day. And doses requirement for the pediatric patient over 12 years is almost similar to the adult patient. Complications more specific to intrathecal baclofen therapy include the risk of infection. This is a foreign body, so there is always a risk of infection, risk of device malfunction, and drug-related complications. So drug-related complication can be sudden baclofen withdrawal because of the pump failure or some catheter disturbance, some disconnection, migration. So all this can cause baclofen withdrawal. And baclofen overdose, when there, because of the human error or because of some error, if the dose is more than what is therapeutic dose, then it can cause serious complications in those kind of patients. Now will come the signs of overdose, and which can vary in severity depending on the overdose. Drowsiness, lightheadedness, dizziness, somnolence, sometimes respiratory depression in severe cases. Seizure can occur in very overdose of baclofen. Nostril progression of hypotonia, loss of muscle tone progressing from the site of injection to the lumbar region to the head, loss of consciousness leading to coma. So all these things can happen because of overdose. Now, imaging evaluation of intrathecal baclofen pump catheter system. Now, when pump is functioning well, it's okay, nothing is required. The pump malfunction, then we assess by doing X-ray abdomen, LS spine, thorax, just to see whether any disconnection, any kinking of the catheter, any migration of the catheter, all these things. Fluoroscopy. Sometimes we require fluoroscopy to see the intrinsic pump function, pump rotor or roller function. Can also be obtained if the radiograph was not radiograph is not adequate or functional assessment is required. We do a fluoroscopy before programming and we do fluoroscopy after programming. And we see how the roller function is there. If it is moving, then intrinsic pump function is fine. Then if it is also not diagnosed by fluoroscopy, then we can do contrast study. Injection of the contrast material like iohexol or Omnipeg by the catheter access port. But what we have seen before, the catheter access port, so we aspirate 2 to 3 milliliter of fluid from the catheter access port and we give the contrast material and we see whether any extra vessation is there in between the intrathecal catheter and pump or anywhere in the length of the catheter or tubing, and also to see the catheter tip locations, catheter migrations, also sometimes any disconnection, but some points like particularly the microscopic perforation and leaks cannot be diagnosed by contrast study. Then we have to do a CT scan of the lumbar spine or CT scan of abdomen just to see the contrast. That is also after giving contrast into the catheter access port, whether any contrast peelage is there or contrast spillage is there or any disconnection is there or whether contrast is at all going to the subarachnoid space, all these things. In few cases, we require nuclear scintigraphy, but I never did it. Nuclear scintigraphy is required where nuclear medicine department is there. Some radionuclear isotope has to be given in the catheter access port and again to see whether it is passing up to the intrathecal space or there is any spillage in any length from tip to pump, whether there is any extra spillage or extra vessation is there. Now, there is another procedure called selective dorsal rhizotomy. As we have said, that it is an excellent procedure, but it requires a good electrophysiological infrastructure, both manpower and also some infrastructural setup is there. If it is there, it is a very cost-effective procedure. We do multi-level laminectomy in the lumbar region, and the L1 to L5 sensory routes are identified by the electrophysiological identifier, and we have to section that sensory routlets. Here we see that SDR procedure, sensory routes are identified here, and we have to open the dura and we have to identify the conus. This is conus. You see, this is conus and this is quadra equina. And from the conus, the roots are going. So anteriorly, there will be motor roots, and posteriorly there will be sensory roots. Sensory roots are identified by the electrophysiological tools, and then it is cut, the sensory rootlets. And so there will be the neural circuit for the tone maintenance will be disturbed and the spasticity will be less. Pathophysiology and everything has been already discussed, so I will not discuss this in detail, just imbalance between the excitatory and inhibitory impulse to the alpha motor neuron. Pathophysiology of the cerebral origin, it is already discussed. Spinal origin, it is also discussed. These are the factors which can aggravate the spasticity. These are the skin lesions, urinary infection, gastrointestinal dysfunction, CNS or systemic illness. That is also discussed by Dr. Anand. These are the causes of spasticity. There are many causes like spinal cord trauma, multiple sclerosis, tuberculosis of the spine, hereditary spastic paraparesis, vitamin B12 deficiencies, spinal AVM, some spinal stenosis of the spinal canal stenosis, thoracic or cervical. These are the causes of spasticity. Now there is the clinical pictures of the spasticity, which is already shown by Dr. Anand. So this is the clinical features of the spasticity. We can get clonus, spasms, spastic, some, contracture. So these are the severe spasticity clinical features. And possible advantage, spasticity also some advantage also. Spasticity gives an advantage, which maintains the muscle tone, helps support for circulatory function, it prevents the deep vein thrombosis, and it may assist in activities of daily living. Consequences, but it may interfere with the mobility, exercise, joint range, and daily activity of the living. It can cause pain, sleep disturbance. Measuring spasticity, there are scales. So we usually use modified Ashworth scales, but there are other scales also. Differential diagnosis, we have seen the catatonia, rigidity, contracture due to some other reason that also can give rise to that mimic spasticity, already discussed by Dr. Anand. And pharmacological intervention, that is already discussed. And these are the drugs which we use during medical management. This is the rehabilitation, which is already discussed by Dr. Madhusri Sengupta. So thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, sir. That was such a detailed and a very, very nice presentation. I open again for discussion with our eminent panelists, Dr. Basu and Dr. Ghosh. If you would like to ask any question or make any comments, please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, a very good evening to everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, sir. Good evening.
Yeah. In fact, I was my knowledge was got quite enriched about spasticity of listening to all of you. And as Dr. Bhaskar sir said that the physiatrists or the physical medicine rehab people are the cornerstone in the treatment of spasticity, because intense physiotherapy is the what should I say, is the main treatment, and all the other treatments, they facilitate probably a good physiotherapy. Regarding the surgical procedure, I just want to add to what Dr. Amit said, that is screening for baclofen pump insertion. So the intrathecal baclofen pump screening procedure is obviously a in-house procedure. Patient needs to get admitted for that, and patient also needs to have a thorough pre-anesthetic checkup for assessment of particularly the ventation, the cardiovascular status, the liver function status, and renal function status. These things should be optimized. And to add to what he has told, a few nitty-gritties of the procedure. What we do is that for adults, we start with intrathecal injection of 50 microgram of baclofen, which is 1 ml volume we inject very slowly. We do it over 10 minutes. And obviously, patient has to have a venous access before giving the injection. Patient has to have a proper monitoring, routine monitoring, that ECG, pulse, blood pressure, and all resuscitative procedure, resuscitation equipments, everything should be available. So it is done just like any surgical procedure. It is done in an operation theater, proper operation theater with all proper precautions. So as a first stage, we inject 50 microgram. Volume is 1 ml, very slowly over 10 minutes. And then the patient is assessed, like what he said, after 4 to 6 hours. The assessment is obviously done by the scales which he mentioned, the modified Ashworth scale. And if there is improvement in spasticity, then it is fine. We think of giving another injection if there is no improvement after 24 hours. So next injection is of 75 microgram, and this time the volume has to be 1.5 ml. So last time it was 1 ml, this time it is 1.5 ml. Similarly, it is again lumbar puncture is done in the L4-5 or L3-4 interspace, and the drug is injected slowly, 1.5 ml volume containing 75 microgram of baclofen. over 10 minutes. Again, with proper precautions and everything. So again, after 6 to 8 hours, patient is assessed. So if there is not much of a response, then the patient can be taken up for a third injection only after 24 hours. And this time the injection is 100 microgram. And this time the volume of fluid injected is 2 ml. So first is 1 ml, 1.5 and 2 ml. And then it's this time also injected very slowly and the response is noted. And for pediatric patients, what we do is we use the same for little bit bigger children. We use the same dose, that is 50, 75 and 100. But for smaller children, we can start with 25. And if there is no response above 100, even after no response means no improvement as assessed by either the physical rehab team or the neurologist or neurosurgeon, above 100 milligram, we do not go. So if there is no response with 100 microgram, then probably baclofen pump insertion is not advisable. So that is from my side.
Yes, Dr. Madhusri.
Yes, sir.
I can see Dr. Milind Devgakar has joined. That is our privilege. And I will ask Santosh to unmute Dr. Milind Devgakar. He is from United States and he is my mentor and my teacher. So I requested him to join. He has done few thousands of baclofen pump over the last 20 years. So we can get some input from Dr. Milind Devgakar. So Santosh ji.
Dr. Devgakar, namaskar. Welcome to India through this.
Manish.
Yes, sir.
Is
Hello?
Dr. Milind Devgakar unmuted or?
He can unmute himself, yes. Sir, you can please unmute yourself. Yes.
Hey,
Welcome to this webinar, sir. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, namaskar.
Put your video on also. We want to see you.
How are you, Amit? Sorry for crashing this, but I couldn't join at 6 o'clock. I had something to do, so.
Doesn't matter, sir. Your privilege that you are here. So thank you, sir, for joining. So you have a tremendous experience of having IBT. So I did few, but not like you. So just give us some input. That complications, sir. I want to ask you because.
Well, I listened to your talk and a few things that I want to say. You should start doing selected dorsal rhizotomies. It's a very simple procedure and it's a very elegant procedure. Few things I want to say about selected dorsal rhizotomies. It works best in CP diplegias. So any cerebral palsy child with diplegia, ambulatory with assistance is the best candidate. And you don't do laminectomies. If you have bone cutter, you do laminotomy, because in children doing that long a laminectomy can lead to some problem while growing up. And then you open the dura, and then you basically use the nerve hooks to separate the anterior and posterior rootlets, and you cut a strip from a glove and then put that strip of glove between the anterior and posterior nerve roots, and then just use your routine nerve stimulator. You don't need any specialized equipment. You put in EMGs in all the 4 or 5 major muscle groups in the leg, use the nerve stimulator, and with nerve stimulator you can grade the rootlets. Now sensitive rootlets could be from 1 to 4. It's not only always 1, it could be more than 1. So you stimulate everything, L2 to S1. Don't go for L1. L1 is not that much involved in spasticity. And with S1 and S2, you put some electrodes around anal sphincter. So you know you're not cutting the sphincter rootlets. And then you stimulate. And then there is a grading of stimulation. So grade 0 is if you don't see any response. Grade 1 is if you see only response in the muscle group that rootlet is supposed to be attached to. You don't cut that. Grade 2 or grade 3, grade 2, 3, and 4 are the roots which are expanded innervation roots. So you see more than 2 muscle groups or all the muscle groups, those are the roots that are causing spasticity. And you cut those roots, not completely, 60%. That's it. You use a micro scissor and cut the rootlet about 60% and just leave it there. So it's a very good surgery. Only thing
Yes.
is it needs inpatient rehab because these kids come in walking, and the moment you finish surgery, they are not able to walk. So you got to keep them in hospital and tell the parents before this that, okay, this can happen. And 3 weeks of in-house physiotherapy will make them walk better. So that's something you should start doing. It doesn't need pump. It's cheap. For first few surgeries, I can come down if you want to and can show you how to do that. But that's a very, very good therapy for CP diaplegia. We've done it in adults also in hereditary spastic paraparesis. It works well. We've done it in adults with MS and spinal cord injury where the pump keeps on getting infected or keeps on getting blocked and you got to revise it 2-3 times. But that's a very good surgery you should start doing. As far as pumps are concerned, what you told is pretty much what it is, but a few things in that also. When you enter, don't enter from midline, because midline, the spinous processes, every time they flex and extend, they keep on pushing on the catheter and catheter breaks. Go about 2 centimeter paramedian. And then once you are 2 centimeter paramedian, go from there and access from there. So you go through the paramedian muscles and put a catheter from there. It's much more easier to anchor because of the paramedian muscles and they're less likely to break. As far as the tip is concerned, I'm not such a big fan of location according to the disease. People say that actually baclofen is hypotonic than CSF, so it rises up. But conventionally, people have said lower limb spasticity, put it around T10. T10 is the commonest. Upper limb spasticity, put it about C71. Spinal cord injury spasticity, if you can negotiate the tape above the site of injury, that's perfect. But even if you are not able to, CSF will carry the baclofen up and down. So this whole concept that the tip should be according to where the disease is, a lot of people don't subscribe to that. As far as complications are concerned, you said what was right. The complications are, this is a small surgery. This is like shunt. When no one gives you credit for doing a good baclofen pump. But if it goes wrong, then it goes terribly wrong. So you got to be very, very careful about it. The immediate surgical complications, one of the commonest is CSF leak and post-puncture headaches. Those are very common because the Tuhi needle is about 0.5 millimeter bigger in diameter than the catheter. So there is a sleeve of opening around the catheter from which CSF can come. So I always keep my patient 24 hours flat after surgery and then let them sit up. And always tell the patients might get some headaches. If the headaches last beyond a week, I will do a blood patch at the site of the catheter entry. Normally, if you go all the way through and puncture the anterior dura, you will see always post puncture headaches. So be careful that you don't go to the anterior dura. Don't hit the body and then pull the needle back. So just that's why the C-arm fluoroscopy is very, very useful. The second thing is always put a good purse string around the catheter at the fascial entry point, because that's the entry point which is very important for the CSF leak. So just put a good purse string or 2 purse strings. I put 2 purse strings, one facing this way, one facing this way. So there is always a good purse string around the entry point. There is risk of infection, very little in our case series. As you said, done about 1,200 pumps and our infection rate is less than 1%. Immediate post-surgical risk is pump flipping. So give an abdominal binder to them, elastic abdominal binder, which stays there, which avoids pocket hematomas and which also is good for a pump not flipping. There are 4 anchors on the pump. Make sure you always give those 4 anchors. Otherwise, if the pump flips, you cannot refill it. So you got to go back and reoperate on the patient and all those things. So the second surgical risk is I never seen a nerve injury at all ever. And then medication related risks. Be very sure that you program it yourself, because micrograms and milligrams confusion will kill the patient. This is a surgery that can kill a patient. You get more baclofen and patients will die. So it's very important that programming is done right. And we always do it, our PMNR guys do it. So, but if at all I had to do it, I'm very, very, very anal about it. As far as the troubleshooting, if the pump is not working, then the first thing you do is X-ray, see if there are any breaks. Now, Medtronic, in all their wisdom, have made the newer catheter less radio opaque, so you cannot really tell if it's broken or not. The older catheters were much more radio opaque, but the newer ones are not. So the next thing you do is pumpogram. You said what X-ray dye study. Now, what's important is you have to do it under X-ray guidance, and you have to go to the side port. Don't go to the center port. That's a problem.
Yes.
So go to the side port, and then unless you can take out the fluid, 3 ml of fluid from it, don't inject anything. Because if you are not able to take the fluid out and you inject something, it's going to push all the baclofen that's in the catheter in the spinal fluid. And that will that's another thing that could kill the patient.
Yes.
So it's very important that you should be able to take out 3 ml of fluid before you inject anything in that. In about 50% of patients, you're not able to take out fluid because of the block, the catheter is dry. And so in those cases, you just revise the pump. And there is no point in doing CT, and there is no point in radionuclide studies, really don't show anything. So it's a good idea to revise the pump, open the back incision first, disconnect the catheter, see if the spinal catheter is working or not. And if it's not working, then change the spinal catheter. If the spinal catheter is working, just change the abdominal catheter and the pump, and just go with everything new. Rotor studies are good, but they are time consuming. And in my whole of my life, I have seen only one rotor failing in the pump. So Medtronic is pretty good with their quality testing, and you don't see any rotor failures. So if you can do it, do it. But the thing is to do pumpogram, and pumpogram, you cannot withdraw any fluid, then just go for revision of the whole of pump. Sometimes in higher doses, as you said, we have a lot of patients with this supraspinal spasticity. And with supraspinal spasticity, post-stroke spasticity, even in HSP, you need very high doses. So when the concentration goes about 1,000, dose goes about 1,000, there is a small chance they can develop granuloma. If you think there is granuloma, then it's probably a good idea to do a MRI scan rather than doing the CT scan to make sure there is no granuloma. And if there is granuloma, don't operate. Basically reduce the dose of the baclofen slowly, and then at some point the granuloma will resolve. If it doesn't resolve, then when you operate, don't try to pull the catheter out. If it's stuck, leave it in, just put another catheter in. Granuloma will resolve as soon as the medication stops going from it. That's pretty much it. But consider SDR. SDR is such a good operation, and it has not been used as often as it should be. We used to do a lot of SDRs back in 95, 96, and then again sometimes early, but then baclofen pumps took over, and then I still do quite a few SDRs, and those are very good surgeries. And for baclofen, it's a recurring expense. So in Indian settings, it's a problem, and it's not like a battery where you let it die, nothing happens. Baclofen pump, you don't refill, patient will go in withdrawal. That's another thing. Baclofen withdrawals are sometimes terrible. These patients will stay in ICU on ventilators for days and days and days. And baclofen withdrawal is not, the severity of withdrawal is not related to the dose. Even with small dose like 55 and 60, people will go in severe withdrawal. And if withdrawal is very severe, then you can put an external catheter, the lumbar drain catheter, and then give baclofen from outside if the baclofen withdrawal is very, very severe. But by and far, I think it's a good procedure, and for all sorts of spasticity, it's good. And I think you gave a very good talk about the surgical aspects.
Yeah. Sir, have you encountered a situation where the screening test patient has not passed? There is no response, or very inadequate response to screening test. So in those cases, what do you do, sir? What will be your advice in those cases?
I wouldn't do baclofen pump. Basically, where I practice, the insurance will not allow baclofen pump if the screening test response is not good. The screening test response has to be documented in the
Yeah.
synthetic walk, the number of steps and the time of walk, and it's done very, very religiously. So if it is not good, if it's not beyond 50%, insurance companies will not basically allow. In those cases, then I'll go for SDRs, selected or supervised autonomous. But if the screening test response is not good, you're not really justified to submit patient to a life-threatening procedure. So if it's not good, then you don't do the pump.
Yeah. Okay, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Milind. Thank you so much for joining as well as giving these beautiful inputs. I'm sure it helped every one of us. Thank you so much.
No
And
problem.
Dr. Madhusri, we can see some questions from Dr.
Yes.
Narayan K from Mumbai.
Yes. I see a question. We have already discussed this. At which point should I refer the patient for surgery? Dr. Amit Ghosh, sir, will you just summarize it for Dr. Narayan K, please?
Yeah, actually, we get patients from either pediatric neurologist or a neurologist or rehab consultant when, you know, spasticity is not controlled by medicine and rehabilitation. And even after all this, they have a very disabling type of spasticity. Then they refer to us for either baclofen pump or any other form of treatment of, you know, SDR, whatever it is, that surgical treatment of spasticity. So that is the answer. I think before patient comes to surgeon, they have to go to either rehabilitation specialist or neurologist, whether the treatment is possible by medication or, you know, rehabilitation, braces and your orthosis, something like that. So
I
that
have
is,
a question actually, and it is not necessary that we get the patient for the first time when the patient has developed spasticity. We sometimes get a patient late. So, and by that time, some patients have severe spasticity vis-a-vis contracture. So how can we conclusively decide that this patient has already developed contracture or this patient has got severe spasticity?
Can I answer, Amit?
Yes, yes.
yeah, sir, of course.
Yes, sir.
So for the first question, who should be referred? I divide these patients in 3 different groups. One is ambulatory, second is just ambulatory, and third is bedridden. Now, indications of surgery in all these 3 groups are different. In ambulatory patients, if the patient is working and the adductor gate is coming in the way and the patient knows the risk of surgery, but we get this completely functioning patients with HSP with severe adductor spasticity, and they do want a pump. And so if it is causing problems with activities of daily living and patient is still walking, that's one indication. Second indication in just ambulatory patients is the ambulation is going to get better after you take the spasticity away, then that's a just ambulatory patient group. If it's going to get worse by you taking the spasticity away, those are not the patient you want to operate. Especially patients with ALS, we do some pumps in ALS, and in ALS, it looks like spasticity is making that patient stand, and you take the spasticity away and the patient is not going to be able to walk. You don't do pumps in those patients because the patient's perception is that he was able to walk before surgery and now he's not able to walk. So that's a problem. So you don't do that. In bedridden patients, if the spasticity is painful, if it's going to improve the nursing or bed to wheelchair transfer, if it's causing skin lesions and all those things, then he's a candidate for baclofen pump on SDR. Now, the patients we also get are long-standing, and we are also sometimes worried about whether this is spasticity or contractures. The best way I've seen my rehab colleagues have done is use Botox. I mean, they use Botox in large muscle groups and find out how much does it improve. If after Botox it doesn't improve very much, then these are contractures. And then you can either go for contracture release, but not baclofen pump. But Botox is a very good assessment tool to kind of differentiate between contractures and spasticity.
We can also go under general anesthesia. We can try whether it can be manipulated and if serial casting can be done or Botox with serial casting. Maybe that will also give us some idea.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. We also have one more question from Dr. Deepak from Jabalpur. Can you comment more on Botox role on spasticity? Dr. Bhaskar Ghosh, sir, would you like to answer that question, sir?
So definitely botulinum toxin has got a role in spasticity, but before giving botulinum toxin, you have to assess the patient properly, and you should identify the goals for which you are giving botulinum toxin, and you should also discuss the anticipated outcome. What are you going to achieve by giving botulinum toxin? Because suppose you have reduced some spasticity in the upper limb, but patient cannot walk, so it is not going to help him. So you must assess that what is the anticipated outcome, and you should measure the outcome measures by the scales so that you can document it. And then obviously comes the injection and injection technique. And last but not the least, which I also told at the initial part, is the proper physical therapy and guidance. Now, before giving botulinum toxin, you have to plan the treatment. How? Actually, what the patient want. I had a patient who had a post-traumatic brain injury, and he had a problem of whenever he used to go out, his right upper limb, that arm used to abduct. So this was his problem. So in that case, the patient wanted that although he had some spasticity in the upper limb and also lower limb, but it did not bother him much. He was very much concerned with that posture because it was reflecting on his self-image. Wherever he is going, or for interview or meeting some people, whenever he walks, his hands upper arm abduct. So in that case, when we injected him Botox, he was on botulinum toxin. He was very happy. So you have to find out actually what the patient wants and whether you can give the proper outcome to the patient. Now, next is that you should also look after how the function is impaired due to spasticity. Like a patient has inability to write because of excessive flexion of the fingers of the right upper limb. So in that case, I think the botulinum toxin, if you inject into the flexors groups, long flexors of the fingers, that is going to help him. So you have to find out actually which function is impaired and which part you can improve. Otherwise, you cannot inject botulinum toxin to whole of the muscles because it will require about 400 to 500 units in one setting, and that is very, very expensive. Now, so you have to decide the treatment goal after proper discussion with the patient. Now, another important aspect of botulinum toxin therapy is that in post-stroke spasticity. Many people ask me that when we should give botulinum toxin after stroke. So the answer is very clear-cut. When you find that this spasticity is interfering with patient's improvement or patient's activity of daily living or patient's some function. So there is no time limit. So whenever you find that this spasticity is interfering with the activity, then you should start botulinum toxin. Now, we have already discussed about spasticity and contracture. Milind sir has already nicely discussed that how we can differentiate, and you also told that anesthesia is also general anesthesia is sometimes helpful, but some people are afraid of getting general anesthesia, and they sometimes prefer botulinum toxin. So we can inject it and see whether there is improvement or not. Now, the idea of giving botulinum toxin is to maintain care and hygiene and proper posturing, proper dressing, and time and number of care. It can be reduced by giving botulinum toxin. We can use it. And botulinum toxin injection also optimizes treatment response, and it prevents unnecessary therapy. So, but I do agree it is expensive, and a lot of counseling is required for the patient whom you are injecting botulinum toxin. I have certain patients who gets reimbursement for botulinum toxin therapy, and he has got post-stroke upper limb spasticity, right side, and he used to get botulinum toxin therapy every 4 or 5 months, and you will not believe that with regular injection for about 3 or 4 years, he looks almost normal. But the sad part is that when he cannot afford to eat or when he does not get it, then again gradually over 1 year or so, the previous things comes back. So you have to ensure that at least in post-stroke spasticity, that botulinum toxin therapy is not permanent. But in children with cerebral palsy, sometimes, if you inject botulinum toxin for some time, like a child who is having equinus deformity, and if you so in that case, it helps. You need not inject for all. So actually, the effect of botulinum toxin is from patient to patient, and you need a great collaboration with the physical rehabilitation therapist, that what can be done. And it is not that it is the treatment of choice, but it is only a aid to the therapy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think this answers Dr. Deepak's question. I have a question, sir, if you would
Yes.
answer. What about the chronic patients who come with severe spasticity, who we think might benefit from botulinum toxin? How do you manage them, sir? Do you go for a course of therapy followed by botulinum toxin, or you give the injection so that they can facilitate in therapy and then proceed? What is your method of doing it, sir? The chronic patients?
Yeah, for chronic patient, I think first we have to take the opinion of the physical rehabilitation therapy, that whether the most important thing in giving botulinum toxin is the patient cognition and patient's willingness. If the support patient party wants that patient, if we give botulinum toxin and he will improve, but it is not that. Patient should have desire that I will get improved. It should come from his mind that I want to improve. Otherwise, only by passive physiotherapy you cannot make a patient's improvement to our satisfaction. So you have to those patients who are really desirous. And after discussing with physical therapist, I think we will go for it. If some patients are very enthusiastic, they want that doctor, you give me, let me see what happens. And I think that group of patient improves a lot. In that case, I will give first, definitely. But in those cases, because I don't want to earn a bad name by giving botulinum toxin. Actually, once I was in Bangladesh, I was sorry to see that there were very many cerebral palsy patients who are given botulinum toxin, but they did not know about anything like physiotherapy. They went back to their village and they left the patient child on their own. So it's no idea of giving, because it earns a bad name that and people comes to you thinking that I get Botox and I become all right. So in that case, you have to assess those patients who are really wants to have it. We always give it, and at the first instance. Otherwise, we go for physical therapy, and when they do not improve, we may try.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other question in the forum. Do any of our panelists or speakers want to ask any question?
I have a question, Madhusri. I have a question, Dr. Anand and Dr. Bhaskar Ghosh. Sir, apart from baclofen, do you use any other drugs for medical therapy, like dandrolene sodium or any lot of medicines what Dr. Anand has discussed? So apart from baclofen, what about the other drugs?
See, as per my knowledge or experience goes, baclofen is mostly effective in spinal spasticity. It does not help too much in case of spasticity due to cerebral origin. This is my personal experience and thinking. But definitely we try it out, because whenever patient do not have any other thing, But baclofen has one disadvantage that you all know, that it aggravates seizure disorder. So many patients with either cerebral palsy or post-stroke condition, they have associated seizure disorder. So in that case, high dose baclofen therapy is very difficult. So in that case, or also in cases where baclofen alone cannot maintain improvement, I have used along with that tizanidine, and also sometimes other drugs like this dalperisone. So these are drugs we have sometimes used, but you know, in the spinal plasticity, definitely baclofen is a good drug. Dr. Anand, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, definitely. I would like to add on with something because what is there we have, sir, we are using baclofen very commonly. That is very true, and because of the side effect profile, now we have moved very significantly to tolperisone also, and it is also very much effective in the in controlling the spasticity in patients. And experience with tizanidine is very good. I told you in my personal experience, the experience with tizanidine is very good. It's a very good drug, and the response for the patient is also very good, but the tolerability is very poor for the patients, and they are not able to tolerate in little bit higher dose also, like 6 milligram and 8 milligram. They are not able to tolerate, and the cardiac toxicity and the sedation comes. And this is very common. The use of other drugs like dantrolene sodium and drugs like cannabinoids. Cannabinoids we have not used. Dantrolene sodium we are using in only patients of some patients of catatonia neurologic malignant syndrome we have used in neurological patients, but not in classically in patients of spasticity. So it is very difficult, but these three drugs are very commonly used, like tizanidine, tolperisone, and the baclofen are very commonly used, and they are combined together very commonly in cerebral palsy patients, in which the response to the one medicine is very poor. So we are combining this tizanidine and along with, I will say that like clonazepam, these drugs are also being used in cerebral palsy patients, because they can control both the dystonia and spasticity together, in which both the things can be present together. So these centrally acting drugs are very commonly used in this group also.
So tizanidine and tolperisone, how long you can give to a patient?
Tizanidine and tolperisone, very difficult. So because once present, spasticity is always there. So in my experience, for last, what I will say that I have seen patients continuing for more than 10 years. More than 10 years. Yeah, more than 10 years I've seen patients who are coming, they are continuing with the tizanidine or tolperisone, they are continuing. Tolperisone is not that much effective, but tizanidine is definitely one drug that is effective.
You can continue for a long time, almost 10 years.
It can stay there for years, and some of them will be taking for lifelong.
Well, good.
Ma'am
So-
is asking a question.
Yes, sir.
Madhusri,
Yes, sir.
just to congratulate you all. So it's a very excellent session, and you conducted it so well. And all the speakers, I must congratulate. And for the to have Milind here, the dawn of this area. So that is very. I am so happy to have him and his inputs. And I congratulate all the speakers for excellent delivery, and also the comments by the discussions by the experts like Bhaskar and Indranil, and also lastly to Milind, to see him here. So thank you very much for this, very excellent, and the session is so nice. I enjoyed it fully. So,
Vibhuti, nice to see you also.
Thank you so much.
Vibhuti, very nice to see you. I see you after such a long time, but you still look the same. You haven't changed at all.
Yeah.
So, does anybody have any more questions? There is no other question in the group.
Well,
See. No.
I don't think anybody has any questions. So we can
Discussion
give
was so good, sir.
vote for thanks and then close the session. We can
I-
go to Dr. Deepak, Mr. Deepak, Mr. Naik.
Mr. Nayak, are you there?
He's muted. Mr. Naik, you are muted.
Yes. So
Yeah.
thank you very much, audience, for logging in today. We got almost 200 logins. To be precise, 197 from 2 countries apart from India. 7 people logged in from abroad. And we had our special guest today, Dr. Milind Devgavkar. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us today. Today we had a truly multifunctional, multidisciplinary approach to spasticity, where neurophysicians, neurosurgeons, rehabilitation experts, and also the device experts coming in to talk on this session. We had a wonderful session. I hope our audience must have liked it. We thank Dr. Amit Kumar Ghosh for conceptualizing this program. Today's webinar, today's speaker, Dr. Amit Kumar Ghosh, Dr. Siddharth Anand, our expert and founder member of Movement Disorder Society of India, Dr. Bhaskar Ghosh, Dr. Indranil Ghosh, and Dr. Milind Devgavkar. This was nicely coordinated, as Dr. Bhaskar Ghosh said. The fulcrum, the middle point of the entire spasticity therapy is the rehabilitation. And we had today to coordinate this excellent session, Dr. Madhushri. So thank you very much, Dr. Madhushri, for excellent coordination with your own insights and presentation. On behalf of Health and You, would like to thank all the audience and the speakers, the experts today for allowing us to carry this webinar. We enjoyed it. Thank you very much for supporting Health and You. Please continue. And thank you very much for taking care of COVID patients in these difficult times. Happy days will be coming again, and we wait for that. Thanks a lot. We close the webinar here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.